why did you want to make this? I know the journey of how you made it, but why did you want to make the documentary?
I think the honest answer is I'd never like planned to make a documentary or like being a documentary maker as a sort of a side hustle to making like other movies was not really part of my plan, other than the fact that as a Sparks fan, and also getting to know Ron and Russell, I could talk a bit about that later, but I'd sort of got to know them in like 2015, probably about 6 years ago to this day or something. It was only like sort of 6 years ago exactly that I met them for the first time. And so I knew them for a couple of years. And then through that period, and maybe it was just like sort of, it started to happen by osmosis, but I started to say it aloud to friends of mine, why hasn't somebody made a documentary about Sparks? And as somebody who watches a lot of documentaries and a lot of music documentaries, I started to feel aggrieved on their behalf that there wasn't a documentary about them. And so I just started saying it to sort of people like that I knew were like fancying, why isn't somebody done a documentary about Sparks? Like, they're the best, most influential band that haven't had a documentary about them. I've seen documentaries about bands that are about a tenth as important as Sparks, and why isn't there a documentary about them? And also another thing as well, which I'm sure fans in the audience will understand, is that I was very aware that like even people who were fans, that there was like people had different perceptions of Sparks. And like in the last like 15 years, I spent a lot of time going between London and Los Angeles. And like as a Brit, like a lot of people, like your key like kind of memories of Sparks is like, you're either like remember them on 1974 on Top of the Pops, or like me, you remember them in 1979 on Top of the Pops. And you've either followed them all the way through the career, or you haven't, or they've come back into your life, or they haven't. And then you go to LA and you talk about Sparks, people say, oh yeah, Angst in My Pants, one of my favorite albums. But then those people don't necessarily know about the previous stuff. And I thought, well, this is interesting, because you've got a band who have a following in different countries, but with different important albums. So they, obviously, as you see in the documentary, they're an odd one in terms of they had hits in different countries at different times. And so there was part of me that like, you know, having sort of, if fans are in the audience, I'm sure you've tried to explain to people who don't know Sparks who they are, or who they are even beyond kind of the one or two hits that you might know, and try to explain the whole story and an overview, and like, no, their first album is 2 years before Queen. Oh no, you know, that Electro album is 2 years before Depeche Mode, and all of those kind of things. And Ron and Russell are too modest to do that, so somebody else had to show the receipts, you know. So it was that thing where I just kept saying this over and over again. And then I was at a Sparks concert in 2017 in Los Angeles, on the Hippopotamus tour, and I was with the director Phil Lord, who's also a fan, and who we'd been to see FFS before together. And I was also, there was a key detail here that was important. Is like, I was looking out at the crowd, and like, it was like between like 16 and 60. And then I was standing in the VIP balcony, and to one side was Steve Jones from the Sex Pistols, and on the other side was Tony Basil of Mickey fame. And I thought, this is interesting. And I said to my friend, I said, somebody's got to do a documentary. I said to Phil Lord, I said, somebody's got to do a documentary about Sparks. Like, blah, 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 best influential. And he goes, why don't you do the documentary about Sparks? I said, yeah, I will. So he kind of like is the one who just pushed me over the edge. So goaded into it by Phil. And then I spent the whole of the concert thinking about that. Mm-hmm. And then after the concert, I went up to Ron and Russ. I said, hey, I want to talk to you guys about something.
Straight away.
And I said, does anybody ever approach you about doing a documentary? And then what I found out afterwards, which probably some of you know, is that people had approached them over the years, and they had always said no. And part of that was because they didn't want to, I think part of it was because they wanted to, if they did it at all, I think they had no plans to do a documentary until I came along. And it was partly because they liked my films and we'd become friends and they felt comfortable with me. And also, I think some of the other like people who had approached them had sort of wanted to say, yeah, we want to talk about the 70s. And there's that thing where, you know, like they didn't want to be ossified as a 70s band. And there is that thing where it's like, you know, I call it like the curse of Top of the Pops too. It's like, no, Sparks are more than just like this town on Top of the Pops. It's like, it's a whole other story. And also they didn't want it to feel like an obituary, that it was just like sort of, this is the end of it. So,
or an expose as well, I imagine as well.
Yeah, I mean, a way of telling the story without kind of like ruining their enigma. Well, I mean, it makes me laugh at the end of the movie that they say like, we feel we've revealed far too much than we were comfortable with. They said, you haven't revealed anything.
That's the thing, is like, I was kind of like, I was a Sparks fan. I was not an Uber fan like yourself, but it's that thing where you watch the film and you realize how much musically you know about them. But in terms of their story, I didn't really know that much about it. But you've told us loads, but you've still managed to gift them this enigma that still surrounds them in a way, in terms of there's a preciousness almost about that, because it's part of what we love about them.
Yeah, and I think that's the way, I know that's the way that they like it. It's not that they watched the edit of the film and said, we want more about that. And there were some things that were like off the table, like that they didn't really want to talk about relationships full stop. So the little bits that come through, like talking about Jane Wheedlin or talking about Miss Christine, sort of like, they just came out. And to Ron and Russell's credit, they never asked me to cut those bits out. And I think actually Ron Mael said that his favourite thing about the entire film was Jane Wheedlin admitting she had a crush on him. That was like his high point of the documentary. So there was that thing about finding that balance. And I think part of that is like, they have such an enigmatic presence. It served them well to sort of, for fans to be able to project onto them whatever they want them to be. Because in a way, there's no wrong answer about Sparks. And they're not going to correct anybody in terms of like what they think about them or don't. And that's sort of part of the appeal. And then actually when we were making and also the other thing that they say as well, which I think is interesting, they say the drama is on the record. And I think that's an interesting thing as well, because like other like brothers in rock, the other most famous brothers in rock, the Everly Brothers, or like Dave Davis and Ray Davis from the Kinks or Oasis, like the thing that you know most about them is that they hate each other's guts, or there's this kind of competition with them. Even like Barry Gibb and Robin Gibb, there's like a competition over like who's the lead singer. And sometimes, in some cases, like that kind of like sort of the soap opera side of it starts to outweigh the music. And like obviously Ron and Russell have such a healthy respect for each other that that's never been an issue. And as they say in the documentary, one respects what the other does and knows that the other one does what they cannot. And they've managed, and that's the only way they've managed to kind of keep going for as long. But when we were making the documentary, we were sort of talking about this element of like, and so that's where the idea for the thing at the end came from, was I sort of like, it wasn't always planned, that bit of like sort of adding in new facts and stuff, but I suggested to them quite late in the day, I said, what about if at the end of the documentary we just put out a bunch of bullshit facts about Sparks? So they wrote all of those facts, and then I came up with the last one, which I'm very happy with. But it was something that was just, also like, what's interesting is like, a friend of mine watched it and said, did they write all those? I said, did you write all those lines for them? I said, no, they're funny. They're like good actors. Like I wrote the feed lines for the FAQ section at the start, but they wrote all the answers and they wrote all of those things at the end. And it was just like, it's just like a sort of a gift to do a film about them, because there's not many pop stars who can laugh at themselves. Yeah.
Yeah, totally.
I don't think I could do the same treatment with you two.
No. The kind of narrative of it is really emotional. It's a really emotional film to watch, and you kind of get that, a couple of minutes in where they talk about their dad passing away, and then also just this journey that they've been on, of the success at points and then it not, and it's you kind of really feel for them along that journey. But in terms of the structure of it and how you would tell that narrative, was that something, you say you watched them at that gig and you were working out how you would tell the story, was that something that came quite easy to you in terms of how you would visually tell it?
I'm not sure about visually. One of the things that I think was interesting to them was the sort of like, which I think if previous people had approached them, it might be like concentrating on specific albums and periods. But to me, the thesis was that like, it's wrong to sort of suggest that like the island years of like Kimono and Propaganda and Indiscreet are like the golden years, because it's like, well, what if the golden period is still going? Like, what if like to me, and where I sort of like turned from being like, in my years of knowing, I'll come back to this in a second. There's a period of Sparks where it's like in a pre-internet age, with a band like Sparks, you have to do quite a lot of homework to follow them, because like as some I'm sure fans know, there's periods where they would disappear from like the UK for like a decade, or they didn't tour in the UK between 1975 and 1994. And I think the only, apart from the Top of the Pops appearances and that one Wogan appearance in TV AM, they were sort of like absent from the UK. And unless you were a member of the fan club, you might not really be able to follow them at all, you know. So there was a thing where I sort of turned from being like a big fan to like sort of a proper evangelist was really in the century since Little Beethoven, because it just felt to me with every album after that, it was just sort of, their story was so confounding in that it went against the trajectory of every other band who had been going that long. Like producing like material that was good as anything they did back in their heyday. What the heyday is still going, I say. When they have the opening of the Cannes Film Festival, the heyday is still going.
Yeah.
Like so, but also it's just like this stuff is like, what other bands really can you say were kind of kept that quality control like that high, or even are doing albums that are getting more ambitious, you know? So I just found that really astonishing, and so that was like a big part of the story I wanted to tell, and I sort of knew that like, well, to tell the story, you have to kind of tell the story of every album, because also Sparks are a band where the misses in inverted commas are as important as the hits in inverted commas. And like the albums that are like seen as being flops at the time, you might find like in this documentary that an album that Ron and Russell had discounted themselves, like introducing Sparks, that they would have never thought until they saw the documentary that Flea from the Red Hot Chili Peppers happens to know every single lyric of that album off by heart and could talk about it as he does on the deleted scenes for like a good half an hour. And so that they were like, wow, okay. So in that way with a band like that, it's like there's no album that isn't loved. And then, you know, in that sense is like, as Russell says at the end, is like, what is the measure of success?
Yeah.
It like, I mean, nobody can watch the documentary and say that Sparks aren't successful, but they have their own kind of, you know, they're doing it by their own kind of like scale. Do you know what I mean?
They're doing it for the right reasons.
Doing it for the right reasons, but they've done it on their own terms.
Yeah.
And that to me is just what's astounding about it.
Well, I think that you replicate what he says in terms of the dramas and the music, and you allow the music almost to drive, you know, the journey of all those albums, drive the narrative of because those records really reflect where they are as people and where they are as a band, I think, as well, through that narrative. The amazing collection of contributors that you have in there, and I love that George Moroder's in there as well. I was literally like gobsmacked when I saw him visually for the first time. How easy or hard was that to decide and I guess keep that down, because when you start, I guess they all come out the woodwork in terms of who's been influenced by Sparks and who's fans, or how did you navigate?
I mean,
that?
I probably, if we didn't have to finish the documentary, could have kept on interviewing people about Sparks. At a certain point, the pandemic stopped things. It's like, oh, I guess we have to stop now. Like, but I guess there were sort of different portions of it. There were like 4 sections of like contributors. There's like people who have worked with Sparks, which in itself is an amazing list of people, of band members and producers, even just producers of Todd Rundgren, Tony Visconti, Muff Winwood, Giorgio Moroder, and members of the band and managers and all people that have worked with them over the years. And then it's like some kind of like artists or sort of celebrities who have been on record as being Sparks fans. And, you know, it includes like Duran Duran and, you know, Chris Difford from Squeeze and Vince Clarke and Andy Bell. And then there were like people that, some of whom I think are in the audience. In fact, we put the word out on social media through my Twitter and Instagram and also Sparks to sort of ask people, do you have any memories of Sparks or photos or videos? We'd love to hear from you. And some of the emails that we got to that account were like so sort of powerful and poignant that we asked those fans to come and talk. I think, is Vera here? She was earlier. Maybe she came to the early one, the concert one. But there was sort of some, like, for example, Julia Marcus, who's the 14-year-old stage invader in that
love
Fairfield
her reaction.
Halls. Like, she emailed us and it was that amazing thing. It's like, we have that footage. And she wrote this amazing email, and George Henkin, like one of our great producers, sort of showed me this email. I said, we should just get her to say that on camera because it's what an amazing story. And then it's like we were able to pinpoint her in the footage. And, you know, that stuff is just amazing. So that was, and then the final sort of, I guess, the mystery box segment of it was like me sort of like guessing who may or may not be a Sparks fan just by gut. And I'd say 4 out of 5 times I was right. And so that's people like Neil Gaiman, Beck Flea, Mike Myers, Fred Armisen, where like either like by text or email or even sometimes at a party saying, you like Sparks, right? Oh my God, I love Sparks. Well, and so that was like a real thing to Ron and Russell, because Ron and Russell weren't on set, but they'd sort of know about the schedule, and then they'd see, Edgar's interviewing Mike Myers on Monday? What? You know, so those things were, I mean, I could have like carried on, and, you know, there are obviously some people who are kind of more difficult to pin down to sort of be in it, but it was really just, I think the breadth of musical artists says a lot about them, because they've straddled so many genres, the fact that it can go from like Duran Duran to Thurston Moore and or the Sex Pistols to like Erasure, it's like a sort of a big cross section of like pop and rock.
Yeah, and the fact that they're really kind of vocal and honest about the influence and how ahead they were, Sparks were, you know, in terms of what they were doing, the decisions they were making on the sounds of those records.
No, I mean, I think it's like a big thing for Ron Russell, because Ron Russell is sort of too modest to sort of say we were first. So then when Vince Clarke sort of says on record, we ripped off being a moody synth player from Sparks.
I love that Pet Shop Boys bit as well. That's really, there's a lot of laughter in the room at that bit.
I like the fact that Vince Clarke can't name Chris Lowe out loud. Like, as he goes, the guy from the Pet Shop Boys is like, you know his name. I like that. That's throwing a bit of shade. It's like the guy from the Pet Shop Boys.
And yourself, and putting yourself in the film as well. Was that always going to be the case?
It was because another celebrity had not turned up, and we had 3 hours free, and so it was like, well, I could talk. Like, so that's the only way. I wasn't planning to be in it, but it was literally because another director who shall remain nameless, Tim Burton, they flaked on us, and we suddenly had 3 hours free in the studio. So that's where my interview came in.
It works though. It really, I don't know. It adds to the emotion, I think, of it as well.
I mean, I could have talked for the full 140 minutes about it, but like, I mean, I was, you know, it was sort of just out of necessity, but I'm happy to be in it.
I know that some people were here earlier for the live concert film as well. Where did that sit in terms of, was that shot specifically for footage for here, or how did that work, and how was that experience for you?
That was, I mentioned this in the intro for the people who were here earlier. It was the first thing that we shot. And it was almost the thing that, like, kind of, in terms of leverage of getting it financed, was something where we sort of had something like a date to hit, like where, you know, the MRC who financed it, and like, thank God they did, was like, you know, like, let's make the movie. But it's still that thing of like, it's a thing that may or may not be happening. And suddenly there was a thing of like, they're playing in London on May the 18th, like, sort of, I can't remember what minute it was in May, but it was like, we have to shoot this concert. So it was a way of like getting things started. So it was the first thing that we shot, and you know, I never shot a live concert before, and that was a learning experience. But like, I mean, really, it's just about getting them on record. I mean, you only need to see them live to sort of understand what an incredible vocalist Russell Mael is, or even just to get through the set. And like, without a false note, it's just like, even just watching it today, and I was there at the time, I was like, man, he just goes straight from This Town Ain't Big Enough for the both of us into My Baby's Taking Me Home without breaking a sweat. It's like incredibly impressive, and both of them. But Russell is a vocalist, and I think like some of the live stuff, it's like he almost like sounds better now on some tracks than he does even on record. It's really astonishing. What
was the experience of making a documentary like for you in terms of, you know, your kind of day job in comparison to making a feature? Was it a massively different experience for you?
Yeah, I mean, it's less stressful than making a feature where, like, when you're making a movie that you have come up with the idea, like, sort of all you're trying to do is, by the end of any day, is to get what's in your head on the screen. And with something like this, you're sort of just kind of like capturing stuff. And I guess like the other thing I'd never really done is, I mean, I've done like Q&As, like I've done what you're doing now with people, but I never like interviewed people. But then there was this thing where it sort of became quite easy, and maybe it was disarming, where it's a funny thing. It's kind of something kind of like quite obtuse about interviewing John Taylor and Nick Rhodes from Duran Duran, but only asking them about Sparks. It's something, because at a certain point, like, you get over the fact, I had quite got starstruck by people who, to me, as a kid, were like TV famous.
Yeah.
I was sort of most starstruck by like Nick Rose, John Taylor, Vince Clarke, Andy Bell, and Nick Hayward. Like people who were like sort of pop stars when I used to watch Top of the Pops.
Did you do that thing of walking in the room and not realising that you were singing one of their songs as you sat down? That's one of the bad habits I have sometimes where you go, okay, I'm glad.
But it was, the thing was very quickly, say interviewing like John Taylor and Nick Rhodes, the fun thing about it is that within like 15 minutes, you're sort of just kind of like fanboys talking about Sparks. And then they're quite relaxed as well. Because it's like they don't have to kind of talk about their legacy. All they have to talk about is how they feel about the band.
Yeah.
And so there's kind of something quite sweet about that. Like, and it was also like there's some sort of lots of sweet things happened that like sort of unplanned. Because there's that thing where you assume that maybe all famous musicians know each other. But they don't, and B, Ron and Russell, as you see in the movie, are quite within their bubble. They're not like people who are on the red carpets or going to like events and stuff. They're sort of concentrating on, if they're not on tour, they're like at home concentrating on producing the next Sparks record. And so there's lots of people that they haven't met. And then that would lead to some really sweet things that I was able to facilitate where I was interviewing Stephen Morris and Gillian Gilbert from New Order, who had never met Ron and Russell. And we were recording it in London, and I did Ron and Russell's interviews in LA and London. I guess, and they were next up in the next slot. And then a really sweet thing happened, which is just funny because to me, they're both like legendary bands rather than just like, kind of, it was just that funny thing. Like Stephen and Gillian said, hey, is it okay if we stay on like 20 minutes and say hi to Ron and Russell? And then Ron and Russell said, hey, is it okay if we come in 20 minutes earlier and meet you? And then like in the canteen in a studio in Islington, then like just being there where they're all like, kind of just meeting each other for the first time. And I sort of just like watching this thing, like this summit of these bands, like it was really sweet. And that happened again with Todd Rundgren. This is a thing that you will see on the DVD, is Todd Rundgren had not seen each other for 46 years. They had never seen each other since the recording. And a lot of people assumed that it was acrimony over the fact they were both dating the same woman, but it wasn't that. They just had not seen each other. But they also hadn't been in touch either. And then when we secured like Todd Rundgren to do the interview, and Todd Rundgren was touring in LA, and then I think he changed his tour plans to stay a day extra to do the interview. And I told Ron Russell, I said, I'm interviewing Todd tomorrow in LA. And they said, should we come down? Would that be cool? And I sort of said, well, I can't imagine that he's changed his like travel plans to come in and say these guys are jerks. So I'm sure it'd be fine. I said, but if there's any reason not to come in or there's anything about it, like maybe come down and I'll like Leo Thompson, my great producer, who's somewhere here, like sort of, I said, I'll give a Post-it note to Leo giving the thumbs up. So I was interviewing Todd and it was going very well. So at a certain point I felt very comfortable about it. And I sort of gave the Post-it note to Leo and it's like, and she was like, so then at the end of the interview, and you'll see this on the DVD, I did the full Eamon Andrews. And I was like, when did you last see Ron and Russell? Oh, 46 years ago. What if I said they were behind that door? He goes, come on. And then they came out and then they met each other and like it was just a beautiful thing. And I didn't put it in the documentary because it was almost like I didn't want to just cut it down to one bit. So I thought like this is literally like a short film of them just kind of like chatting, and it was really sweet. And the sweetest thing in terms of like, it sounds like a really dorky thing, but it's so sweet. They were talking for a long time, and then I noticed Russell in his hand had a copy of the Half Nelson album. And I said, Russell, did you bring that for Todd to sign? He goes, yeah. And I was like, that is like, I mean, of course you would. Like sort of, and it was just the sweetest thing is that he brought a copy of their album for Todd to sign, which is like, my heart.
Oh my God, that's so cute. What, so that's going to be on the DVDs. What other treats can we look forward to on the DVD?
It's just bits of it, like a lot of extended interviews and other bits. Like I guess I did something in the documentary which didn't ultimately make it, and it felt like a sort of different kind of documentary. Was I did some stuff where I had Ron and Russell visiting old haunts, like going to like their mum's old shop or like on the beach or at Island Records, and where they first played at the Pheasantry on King's Road. And they were really sweet bits, but there was something that kind of happened almost immediately was that it felt like those bits felt like you had to kind of know. It felt like an assumed knowledge thing.
Mm-hmm.
Like one of the things with this that was very sort of clear to me was that it had to be as much an introduction as it was a celebration. That you had to make the movie for people who never heard of Sparks before, as well as people who love Sparks, or even like you might know a little bit of Sparks, but not a lot. There is a lot of music documentaries, and even ones that I really like, where I sometimes, and even ones that I like, I feel sometimes I stand back and I think, if I didn't already know that artist and I was watching this for the first time, does this film like let me in? And I'm not mentioning any names of documentaries, but there's ones where I feel like sort of like if you didn't already know some of the songs, this film doesn't give you any time to fall in love with them. And so there's that thing sometimes, unless it's like the Beatles or like Dylan or Stones, like where you can maybe assume that everybody knows, but like in 100 years time, they might not. So like, why not introduce them properly, like, and just so you could all like fall in love with them for the first time. So that was something I wanted to do with this. And these little bits of them on location were really sweet, but it felt like, oh, this works if like it was like the follow-up documentary. Mm-hmm. And so very quickly as we were editing, they just kind of like didn't fit. It felt like watching, and I don't mean this as a knock, but like, you know, like Anna Yentob, like an Imagine episode. Not Imagine, Arena, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Is it,
no, it's Imagine.
Yeah. Like that great Ray Davis one where Alan Yentob takes Ray Davis around Hornsey Town Hall. And it's great because it's like, they're just taking him around the Kinks' first gig. So it felt a little bit like that, and it felt this tone is really sweet, but it just doesn't fit with the rest of it and the kind of the oral history. So all of those bits are on the DVD, and some of them are really sweet. Like my favorite one is when they go back to what was the Pheasantry on King's Road, which is now the Pizza Express on King's Road. And like Ron gets on the piano and they do like a little, I was like watching them and I said, you guys should, I mean, when you next come back, can you do like Prince? Can you do like an after gig show where just the two of you go to the Pizza Express on King's Road and just do like a little cocktail act? It was very sweet. So that all of that stuff's on there.
It's really wonderful because, like you say, you want the doc to be something for all those levels of fans, sort of thing. And I think that what this film will do for so many people, it gives them another life again. I feel in terms of for a whole new generation of Sparks fans that haven't even discovered them yet.
Well, my favorite quote in the documentary, and it's something that's kind of obviously for some fans, there is that thing where like Sparks is a bit like a secret handshake band in terms of like, and I'm sure some people in the room feel this is like, this is my band. Like, I don't want them to get bigger because this is my band. And there's two things about it. It's funny, if you ask Ron and Russ about that, they'll say, new customers always welcome. And the other thing, my favorite quote in the documentary, and it's the bit that makes me the most emotional because sadly he's no longer with us, is Gary Stewart from Rhino Records, who's featured quite heavily in the documentary, sadly like not passed away. And his thing that he says at the end, where he says, I don't feel any ownership of them. I feel that it's really important when new fans come along, not to say, hey, I was here 20 or 40 years ago, where were you? I say, welcome aboard and here's more. And I that really like struck me, that line. And I feel that about, not just about music, I feel that about films as well. I feel that kind of like snobbishness when people say, oh, I can't believe you haven't seen blah, blah. And it's like, what does it matter? Like, we went alive when the Marx Brothers films are on at the cinema, but we can all agree they're funny. What does it matter?
Yeah.
So, like, sort of Sparks, you know, it's like, you would hope that people would be listening to Sparks in 100 years' time, you know?
Absolutely. It doesn't matter when you find them, it's the fact that you found them.
When we were doing, with this showed at the Sundance Festival on Thursday, and I did my first bit of in-person press with Ron and Russell. And I'd done like 1 billion Zooms with them, including with you. Like, not to say that wasn't a good one. It was one of the best ones.
Fine,
but it was one of the top Zooms. But we'd done a lot of Zoom interviews, and then we finally did some press in person. And then it was just really funny being on the red carpet with them because it was that thing where you could, like, there was two things that were said. Like, once there was one that I was asked a question in front of them. They said, "Who was the most exciting person you interviewed for this documentary?" And I was like, Ron and Russell Mael, like standing right here. And then they said something, they were talking about, you know, like the Beatles and like sort of, you know, people still listening to the Beatles in 100 years. And somebody said, do you think people will still be listening to Sparks in 100 years? And Ron said, we're still going to be recording.
What was when they sat down and watched the film for the first time, what was both their individual reactions to you?
I mean, sadly, because of the pandemic, I was not there. It was one of our for them as well, they were sort of sad about it too, because we were split, I was in London, they were in LA, there was like, with no end in sight to when the lockdown might kind of end, there was no way of getting there. So at a certain point, I sort of like stalled on showing it to them for a long time because I wanted to, in the vain hope that I could be in the same room. And then eventually they watched it. So I spoke to them immediately afterwards, and I think they were really overwhelmed by it in a very nice way. They were sort of so happy, and that obviously just, especially because they're a band that are very protective of their image and themselves and their legacy, that the fact that they're really, really happy with it means the world to me.
Feels like the most kind of beautiful fan letter to the band. That's what it feels like.
Yeah, I mean, they deserve it. It's like sort of, I mean, I read one review, it wasn't even a negative review, and they called it a hagiography, and I said, yeah, good, they fucking deserve one.
Good news is as well, we've got more Sparks to come as well, because they finally got to write the music for this film, Annette, finally.
No. I mean, that's a bit of like sort of strange kismet, because, I'm really glad Annette came together, because like if it hadn't, it would have been a real bummer ending for like the B plot in the movie. Is like, and they had failed film projects, and then another one didn't come together. So what actually happened, which is crazy, is like the first time I ever met them, like 6 years ago, Ron told me in a sort of, said, oh, keep this under your hat, but like, I'll be doing a musical with Leos Carax, and Annette, as you may or may not know, was actually a Sparks album. It was basically they did the Seduction of Ingmar Bergman, and they did it once on stage at the LA Film Festival, and they wanted to tour that, but it had too many people in it. So then the next idea was to do like a smaller rock opera with only 3 people, which they could tour with. So it was sort of like a rock opera album, like a, Tommy or something, and they were going to do that on stage. They played it, as you see here in the documentary. Leos Carax heard the demos and said, don't release this as an album, I want to do it as a movie. But that was like 7 years ago. And so, they told me about it over coffee the first time I met them, like 6 years ago. And then right through the production, even after I'd finished doing the main interviews, it was like maybe happening, but not quite. And it had a different cast, or like Adam Driver was in it, but the kind of, I think it went from Marion Cotillard was in it, and then she had like a kid and wasn't in it. And then she'd had the kid and was back in it. Like sort of like, so it kind of, so it was actually when I was shooting my new film Last Night in Soho, that during that shoot, I heard like, oh, Annette is happening. And as soon as we heard that, it's like, we're going to Brussels to be on the set of Annette, because we have to, that's like the sort of, the fairy tale ending as Ron and Russell get to make a movie. And weirdly, until like last weekend, that was the last time I saw them in person, was on the set of Annette, like sort of shooting, So there's that really strange kind of, it wasn't planned like this, but the idea that there's in the same, after like, it's like all your buses come at once. It's like they try and get a movie off the ground for like, since 1975. And then there's like 2 in the same year. And also what's amazing is that they went to Cannes to meet Leos Carax. That was their first time in Cannes. Their second time in Cannes is like the opening night film. And when I heard that, I said, oh, you've only been to Cannes twice? I said, that's a good return on Cannes trips. One trip to set up the movie, second trip to open the festival. Pretty good going.
It's going to be out in September. You should definitely go and see it.
Have you seen it already?
Yeah,
it's amazing.
Loved it. I thought it was
it's
incredible. Amazing. It's so brilliant, and they're in it as well in a kind of small way, but brilliant, and obviously in a big way as well. And we've got more coming from you. You're going to have a holiday in between, hopefully. But yeah, so when are we going to get to see Last Night Soho?
That's at the end of October. So, that has 0 overlap with Sparks. Okay. So I just need to...
they're not in it?
No. They should be.
What do you want people to take away from this? Because I've got something different every time that I've watched it.
Well, one of the things that's like separate from Sparks, which I think Ron and Russell have commented on as well, because the film has been out in a couple of months in the States, and something that they have heard a lot and they weren't necessarily expecting, is how like not just musical artists, like, but anybody with any kind of creative ambitions of just kind of showing about what it means to kind of stay true to your artistic integrity through thick and thin. And I think like, like like musicians are having it the worst at the moment. Like even before the pandemic, there's the whole thing of the only way musicians can make money is live touring, because like Spotify doesn't pay anybody anything. and not just Spotify, all the other ones.
Mm-hmm.
And then on top of that, then they can't tour. So like, God knows how many people have like either stopped being in bands or like people like, you know, like with what's on offer now in terms of actually it being a career, who would start one? So I think like, I know a lot of musicians who've watched this have found it really just kind of inspirational of like, don't give up. But you could apply it to any like creative ambition. Because the thing is, in the movie, I think like you can probably pinpoint 8 other places in that story where other bands would have jacked it in and said, you know what, like sort of like nobody's listening, let's kind of just stop. And so like just that kind of like, you know, just that resilience to keep going.
Or made the record that the record company wanted them to make rather than the record they wanted to make.
I mean, it's that strange thing is that like, I honestly, I wonder if you put it to them, if you went back to them in like the mid-70s and say, hey, do you want to be as big as like Queen or like ELO or something? Or do you want what you have? Well, look at this in 2021. Like sort of like, you know, I think they would probably like pick the latter in a weird way. Yeah. It's that thing where like sort of, I think they're very, the thing that they're like amazing, and if any of you have ever met them and stuff, you'd notice is that they're very like happy with their place in the universe. And they've like found a way to deal with it where like, you know, any like bitterness that other people might have just not seem to be an issue. It doesn't eat them up. And it's like, I think it's a sort of like something to really aspire to, is like to be as resilient as they are. And also it's that thing like, it's because they know, it's almost like I feel like there's something about them where it's like they know that, I always feel like they knew something like this was going to happen. Because I think there's this self-belief in that they know how good they are. And it's just an element of like, when is the world going to catch up, you know? And I really feel that, because I, even like seeing them on the Cannes red carpet, I was like, you guys have been like carpet ready for 30 years. It's like, you've been so ready for this. It's sort of amazing seeing like, it isn't something where they seem out of place on the red steps of the Cannes Film Festival. It's like, yeah, of course, Ron and Russell are there. So it's just, I find the whole thing just amazing. And you know, and also they're not done yet either. They're already like halfway through the next album, and they're gonna have a big tour next year. And I just like, hats off to them, you know.
I look forward to the second part of documentary.
Yes, the next 50 years.
Sparks Part 2. Thank you for making this, and thank you for telling their story in the brilliant and creative way that you have. It's been an absolute joy to watch and get to chat to you about it as well. Fabulous Edgar Wright, everybody.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks for coming.